All right, this is James Swift of Uncommon Journalism here today and doing an interview with Mr. Dylan Cornelius, who runs the website Sega Does. Probably the most ambitious fan project I've ever heard in my life, but I will let Mr. Cornelius tell you all about it right now. So go ahead, Dylan, tell us about the origin of Sega Does and what you're planning on doing for the next decade.
Yeah, well, thank you, James. So Sega Does is a blog I started in 2014, and the goal is to review every game ever released for Sega consoles. Um, it's about a 20-year time span from the SG-1000 in 1983. It was pretty much a Japan-only console, Sega's first, to the Dreamcast, which is fan favorite, and it ended at least in America around like 2001, 2002. So a good 19, 20 years of gaming history I'm going to try and cover in about a decade, Lord willing. Yeah, so that's the project, and it is quite mad. uh,
And of course, you actually do have previous experience with these chrono-gaming projects. Can you tell us a little about Questicle and what that was about?
Yeah, so Questicle.net, otherwise known as the Quest to Review Every NES Game, that was a project where I reviewed every North American NES game, and for about 3.5 years I did that, and it's about 750 games, which at the time was a lot, but I had a different way of reviewing those. They're a lot more kind of laid back and casual. The Sega reviews I'm taking a bit more seriously, partially because I have no real history with Sega versus Nintendo. But yeah, that was my first project, and it kind of paved the way for Sega Does.
And do you have any especially memorable experiences just covering the NES games?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any particularly memorable experiences covering the NES games? Were there any games from your childhood that maybe didn't live up to the hype that you remember, or just hidden gems you've never heard of before during that playthrough?
Yeah, actually, so a couple games that I just absolutely loved that I'd never heard of, and probably wouldn't have enjoyed as a child. One of them is Capcom's Destiny of an Emperor, which is this RPG strategy hybrid. At first it kind of felt like a Koei game, but it's almost a more streamlined, just very accessible RPG where you can basically recruit like up to 100 people. Now you can't have them in your party the whole time, but you can go to taverns and like switch them out, and it was just very, very ahead of its time. And Capcom, I think, made one sequel and then just didn't revisit it, probably because it didn't have the sales of like a Mega Man or Street Fighter 2, but it was a great game. And games that did not live up to my childhood remembrances, particularly the first Turtles games. The first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I still have a soft spot for, but it is a horrible game, and I don't care. Like, I don't care. People that say that it's good, like, I respect that, and I know where that's coming from because I loved that game as a kid, but it just isn't. It's just very glitchy and buggy and feels rushed, and also it's super hard. Not the best experience today. And Turtles 2, the arcade game, which is generally hailed as a better experience, is actually a very cheap beat 'em up. Not very fair. For every 2 hits you give to an enemy, you always get 1 in return, which makes it nearly impossible to beat without using some sort of cheat code or having a friend along. But those would be some examples I think I would list. There's plenty more, but for the sake of time, those are definitely some of the more memorable ones.
Yeah, personally, I've always had a fondness for the Manhattan Project above all 3 of those games, so I definitely know where you're coming from there.
Yeah, the Manhattan Project, I think, is just underappreciated, but of course it came out a little too late. I think the Super Nintendo had been out for about a year, and the NES was on the wane, and so just it gets lost kind of in that later period of NES releases, which saw a lot of great stuff that people just don't really remember. Yeah, totally agree with you on that. Manhattan Project is a great game.
And where did your just initial interest in a chrono gaming project stem from? I mean, what sort of put you in that idea to go out there and review every Nintendo game ever released?
So, um, well, I guess for this particular project, I wanted a writing project. It wasn't so much about the gaming aspect. It was more about what's a fun project that I can do, writing project that I can do that will kind of ease me back into writing. I'd been prior to Questicle, I'd been sick for about a year, really sick, to the point where it was hard for me to really think clearly, and it just wasn't a good time. And so I hadn't written in about a year, and that's what I went to college for. So for creative writing, and I love writing, and it's one of my biggest passions. So naturally, I wanted to get back into it once I was getting well, and thought it would just be kind of an easy entry point. The genesis of my interest in chronicling games, though, prior to the phrase chrono-gaming, which is relatively new, that goes back probably to like 2004, when I envisioned like one enormous book that just listed all the games that had ever been made, and like capsule reviews and screenshots. And of course, no book could exist like that. Even in 2004, it would have just been a million pages and too expensive. Nobody would have bought it except for the diehards. But I've always had that on my brain, this idea of chronicling games, in a way that's a bit more entertaining, I think, than your traditional review. Because if you want old game reviews, like GameFAQs has just about all of them. You could just look at any system, any game. There's probably somebody who's reviewed it. So what, making mine stand out, that's always been the goal. And I feel like, if nothing else, I've achieved that. So that besides the notion of an enormous gaming project, you really can tell that this is mine. I kind of have my signature, if you will, on it. But yeah, roundabout way of answering your question, I guess. That is how the chrono gaming stuff got started.
And can you tell us about your review process? I mean, how long does it generally take to review and post information about a game online?
So for the Nintendo stuff, it was a lot shorter. Nintendo or NES games are generally easier, depending on obviously if it's not an RPG or strategy title. You could get a feel for an NES game in about 15 to 30 minutes, and then write something within my reviews at the time were pretty short, like a paragraph or two. So I could get that done in a couple hours, no big deal. Sega stuff takes a bit longer, and that's intentional. I wanted to really take my time with these games because, again, I was a Nintendo kid. I have no real history with Sega other than some like Sonic titles and the big names, Streets of Rage, Toe Jam and Earl, Echo the Dolphin, etc. So I take my time with the Sega stuff, which results in a longer playtime. Usually, again, Genesis games aren't that big, and they're mostly arcade titles at this point where I'm at right now, but still a couple hours, I'd say, at most, for most games. And then the writing process can be another couple hours. And then, of course, I edit and revise, and then it gets put out. Any given week, I'd say, I try and do 2 to 3 reviews a week, and any given week, I'd say I probably invest about 10 to 20 hours, usually, honestly, about 15 to 20, if I'm doing my job right, 15 to 20 hours a week.
And is there any particular reason why you didn't go out after the Super Nintendo or maybe even the Game Boy for Fallout Project Questicle?
Yeah, that was a lot of people were expecting that, and I totally get it. Super Nintendo is my favorite console of all time, but I just thought that the Super Nintendo is also a system that is much beloved and covered a lot, and while there are games that are less known, I feel like, the Super Nintendo has about 550-ish games versus in North America versus the NES had 750, because Super Nintendo, as popular as it was, it sold, I think worldwide sold about half what the NES did. So very good. It was a success, but it wasn't as successful. And so Anyway, I just feel like those games have been covered a lot, and I felt like the Sega stuff had been covered by Sega fans, but I wouldn't call myself, at least when I started, a Sega fan. I was a Sega appreciator, and I guess I'm a fan now, but I still have very little reference for their games, other than what I've played already. And so it's been fascinating for me. I don't know about anyone else, but for me, it's been fascinating to play these games as a new person to Sega, and then have all the Sega fans come and comment and list, on the blog and list their memories growing up with the game. It's just, I really like that contrast, and I don't think I would have gotten that contrast with the Super Nintendo. And as for the Game Boy, I want to plug Jeremy Parrish, who is doing a fantastic Game Boy retrospective project called Game Boy. I think he just changed the name. It's Game Boy Works on YouTube. So I recommend everybody check that out if you're into chrono-gaming.
And one of the interesting things about Sega as a hardware manufacturer is a lot of people only think of it as being like a continuum of the Genesis to the Dreamcast, but Sega was in the hardware market from 1982, going back that early. So what have your experiences been like with some of the pre-Genesis consoles, particularly the SG-1000, which never even came to the US?
Yeah, so the SG-1000, in my opinion, was Sega not knowing what they were doing, and that's okay. Like, I don't think Nintendo really knew what they were doing either for a couple of years with the Famicom. The only difference between the two is that Nintendo knew enough to put some high quality arcade games on there right from the get go with Donkey Kong Jr., and I think Popeye, which wasn't that high quality, but anyway, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And Sega was like, they're known as an arcade manufacturer, and their run in the mid to late 80s is timeless. Afterburner, Hang On, Outrun, Space Harrier, all those great stuff. But in the early 80s, I think the biggest hit they had at that point was Zaxxon, which was huge and graphically was just amazing at the time. But anyway, my point with all that is that the SG-1000 got a lot of these really rough arcade ports from Sega because that was all they had. That was all they knew, and anything else that came to the system that was not an arcade port, like some Mahjong titles. I think there was a couple Pachinko titles. It's just very rudimentary, very basic, and the system SG-1000 I think is an interesting kind of stepping stone to the Master System, which was their next system, and would go on to see release in the States and Europe, unlike the SG-1000. The Master System is, again, not my favorite system. It's much beloved by Sega fans, but once again, I feel like Sega didn't know how to make console games, whereas Nintendo figured that out within a couple of years with Super Mario Brothers, being, of course, the first example of that. And so this idea is that Sega is an arcade game designer, and they're going to make arcade games. And they really pushed that with the Genesis initially, was that, you play the arcade at home, bring the arcade home. But then within the next couple of years, when Sonic came on the scene, you could still see that arcade game mentality within the design of their games, but it did start to change and shift a little bit because they had to keep up with the pace with the Super NES, and so I would say that those first couple consoles are pretty rough, but the Master System does have better games. They've gotten better. Sega has gotten better in my experience, limited as it is, as a game developer, as they've gone along. Or I'm sorry, as a console game developer, they've always been great in the arcade, but as a console game developer, they've gotten better, and I think they will continue to for at least a while. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and the Master System has a very interesting history in and of itself. The thing is, a lot of people are not really aware of this, but in Europe, Nintendo really didn't actually have a stranglehold on the market the same way they did in the US and Japan. So the Master System itself actually was a much more popular console in places like Great Britain than it was in the US. And they actually had games being made for the Master System all the way up until the late 1990s because of Tectoy in Brazil. So when you look at the hardware in the library for the NES and compare it to the Master System, how do the games stack up? Where did Sega do a good job emulating the success of Nintendo, and where did the hardware and software go awry?
Yeah, so the Master System as a console uh, is superior to the NES. I say that loving the NES. I think it's one of my favorite. It is one of my favorite systems, but as a piece of hardware, the Master System beats it, with the exception of the sound chip, which is awful in most games. The NES sound chip is fantastic and has produced many classic, memorable soundtracks. So, as for the library of games, the Master System, well, the NES has about 2/3 trash, 1/3 gold. So if you want to ballpark the numbers, I'd say 2/3 of the NES library, that's about 400 plus some odd games, are mediocre to awful. Not unplayable maybe, but just not games you would necessarily want to pick up and play today. That 1/3 that's gold though is so good that that's what put the NES on the map. And that's what made them, that's what made the system sell 60 plus million units worldwide. The Master System has less outright garbage like the Nintendo has, but its hits weren't as hard. So you've got Phantasy Star, you've got a couple of the Alex Kidd games are pretty solid. You've got weird stuff that few people have heard of, like Golvelius, which is kind of a Zelda clone, but it's a great Zelda clone. And then R-Type, just stuff like that. There's 20 to 30 really great Master System games, but the rest are just kind of there. They just kind of fall in that balance of well, that was a game I played, but it left no lasting memory or impression. And I think we could blame the fact that Sega licensed the Master System out to Tonka in the U.S. and Tonka didn't know what they were doing, which they really didn't. Or that Alex Kidd just wasn't that great of a mascot, which he wasn't. But really, I just think it comes down to the fact that the games just weren't there. I mean, Sega had to make, 95% of the Master System library. Even games that weren't made by Sega, say arcade ports, even arcade ports that weren't made by Sega, they often would do the port to the Master System. The third-party developer wouldn't port it. Sega had to do the work, and that actually continued into the Genesis for a while. But yeah, Sega was doing a lot to make the Master System just be viable, and I think they were stretched too thin. Whereas the NES, of course, had its third-party monopolies, and so even if Sega was able to woo some of the bigger developers, they couldn't, because there was the whole licensing issues with Nintendo for the third party. So there's just a lot of things that really contributed to the Master System's failure that would kind of be reversed when the Genesis came around. Thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great transition to the Genesis and its marketing success. At the time the 16-bit software and hardware hit store shelves, Nintendo had virtually a monopoly on the U.S. video game market at one point, 95% of the total market share. By 1994, 1995, not only had Sega brought that down to about 50-50, there was a brief moment in time where they actually were outselling Nintendo hardware and software. So what exactly did Sega do differently to succeed where, companies like NEC and Atari just couldn't compete with Nintendo?
Yeah, well, I think marketing has a lot to do with it, because, some of the Nintendo gamers who maybe were kids when the NES was around, but were kind of growing tired of the same old stuff, they saw the Genesis the Genesis had more mature games right from the get-go. Now, of course, mature, you put that in quotations because it's not like GTA 5 or something, but, Altered Beast, Revenge of Shinobi, Golden Axe, these were arcade games that looked really a lot like the arcade. Well, Revenge of Shinobi was exclusive to the Genesis, but it resembled an arcade game with this huge lush sprites, and all these games are more violent, I guess, like, and looked realer than like the chibi NES sprites, and so it just had a more mature feel. And then, of course, later with Mortal Kombat, the Genesis version, I think that contributed a lot. Actually, the Genesis version was the one with the blood, which sounds stupid today, but it really had an impact. The Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat just had sweat, unless you put in a certain code that made the sweat look red. I don't know. It was ridiculous. But point being, you have this kind of mixing of things like, okay, the Genesis is the more mature system. Oh, but wait, here's Sonic the Hedgehog, and he is totally a 90s mascot. I mean, he's the perfect 90s mascot. Whereas Mario, at that time, was starting to feel stale, and he's great. He's a stars in great games, but they're all kind of the same type of platformer, and here comes Sonic, and he's got actual personality and attitude, and so that kind of endeared itself to the younger set. So you've got good marketing, Sonic appealing to younger people, and great sports games, which the Nintendo didn't have bad sports games, but these were just, again, the more mature thing. It was licensing, Madden football, all the, great electronic arts support that the Genesis had almost from day one. And then on top, Mortal Kombat, that sort of thing. So I think that really solidified it. And then, of course, Donkey Kong Country came out in late '94, and that pretty much was it for, Sega's brief time at the top. They couldn't replicate that. Even though they tried with Vector Man, they just couldn't make the Genesis produce something as pretty as Donkey Kong Country. So I think that really had a lot to do with it, those things.
And half a century later, the debate still rages on in forums and other online communities. When it comes to the battle of the 16-bit systems, what did the Genesis do better than the Super Nintendo, and what did the Super Nintendo do better than the Genesis?
So the Genesis, I think what the Genesis did better, we'll start with that first, because I adore the Genesis, but the Super Nintendo is still my favorite. I'll do that one next. So what the Genesis did better, I feel like, was that from the get-go, it kind of established itself. It was like the first hardcore system, right? Like nowadays, you consider like PlayStation 4 is like, quote, the hardcore gamers system, which is debatable, but that's for a different time. But the Genesis really was. It was like, okay, you want arcade games in the home, you want a ton of shoot 'em ups, you want just stuff that really Nintendo didn't focus on. They had it. And then when it really started to explode with creativity, like, again, some of the aforementioned games like Sonic and Toe Jam and Earl, and some of their games that started out as arcade stuff, but like would then see sequels that were only on the console, like some of the Shinobi games, and they really hit a stride. Sega did in the mid '90s. That's Nintendo. I kind of feel like dropped the ball a bit, because they're, you see it. There's a pattern in gaming history where companies get comfortable. Happened with Sony with PlayStation 3 and Microsoft Xbox One. They just get comfortable in their success. And Nintendo was very comfortable in their success. Like you said, they had a monopoly. They were fine. But I think Sega really did a great job. They were hungry, and they needed to prove themselves. And they were doing a darn good job. And that's where I think, the difference with Nintendo, what the Super Nintendo did better was by far RPGs. The Super Nintendo looked gorgeous compared to the Genesis. That's not to say Genesis looked bad, but the graphics are definitely lusher and richer, more colors. Super NES Sound Trip, arguably, it is fantastic. That's kind of a mixed bag for me, because I love both the Genesis and Super Nintendo sound chips for different reasons, but I think you could argue that the Super Nintendo is the, quote, better of the two. And, really, the 16-bit console wars was a great thing. And the reason it was great is because it pushed both companies to make some good stuff. And it pushed third parties to make some good stuff. And ultimately, I think both consoles are winners because of that. And I don't think you'll ever see games like that again. You'll never see creativity like that again. And I don't mean to belittle like indie developers or anything like that, but it was just a different time and place, um, and I just don't think gaming will ever see anything quite like it again.
And thus far in your Sega Does chronology, have there been any games that just came out of nowhere and just blew you away?
Yeah. Let's see. I'll go with the Master System for one. Golvelius, I mentioned that one earlier. It's like it is a Zelda clone. It's top down, kind of action RPG, but it also has some shoot 'em up elements, and I would also argue that it's better than the first Zelda, at least. The first Zelda, it kind of took what the first Zelda did and kind of trimmed some of the fat, some of the stuff that was annoying about it. The overworld map is a lot more interesting. It feels like there's a lot more to do. It's not just like go to the dungeons or look for the dungeons and then try and stay alive in the meantime. And it just feels like it is a lot. It's a fully realized version of Zelda. So Govelius for the Master System, definite like left field out of nowhere, great game. For the Genesis, there's been a lot. I think the biggest thing for me for the Genesis is how many stinking shoot 'em ups there are, and the good ones are great. Thunder Force 3, Truxton, even Herzog Zwei, if you want to. That's more of a strategy, but it's like a shoot 'em up strategy hybrid. And I think that one in particular just really caught me off guard. I was not expecting to enjoy that game as much as I did. So yeah, those are the games some of the games that have really, to me, have shocked me in their quality almost 30 years, in some cases 30 years later, that were just, I just wasn't expecting it.